and imitating them. And so you have sensor annotation, human annotation, or self-annotation, like predicting the future. And so all of those are knobs and kind of algorithms you could play with.
Now, Tesla is not the only company trying to build self-driving cars. There's other efforts out there. Sometimes, at least in the media, it's depicted as a bit of a race of who's going to get there first and so forth. And how do you see the Tesla effort different from the other efforts?
It's a very good question because it is very different and it is not obvious. So, for example, there was a video just recently released where someone used a Waymo car and the Waymo drove them to some location. I forget the details. And then they used the Tesla Autopilot full self-driving beta build, and it also drove them there with zero interventions. And so both cars took the same route and got to the same spot with zero interventions. And so to a third-party observer just looking at this, these are cars, they take right turns, left turns, they navigate you to where you need to be. It looks the same. But under the hood, the systems are actually extremely different, like quite different. So the approach of Waymo and many others in the industry, and I would say in the industry, we'll see this two classes of approaches, really. And one is Waymo-like, and the other is Tesla-like, I guess in my naive sort of like description of it, I suppose. And in the Waymo-like approach, you are going to first outfit the car with many more sensors, in particular the use of quite expensive LiDAR sensors that are on top. They give you range sensing around you. And you also have these high definition maps. So you need to drive around before you make the trip, and you need to pre-map the environment in very high definition. And then when you are driving, you know exactly where you are on that map. So you know exactly how to stay on it and how to drive. And this is very different from what the Tesla car is doing, because first of all, we do not have very expensive sensing. We just have a few cameras that give us surround view. And by the way, that's already a lot of information because each camera is, say, several megapixels. And so you're getting many millions of observations of what's around the car, when each ray really is of brightness is telling you something about the world. So you're getting a huge amount of information from cameras that is very, very cheap and economical to produce. And we do not use high definition maps. So we have very low definition maps that are kind of like a Google map. So it's telling you that, hey, you should take a right turn, left turn, etc. But we do not know to a centimeter level accuracy where the curve is. Everything is coming from the system at that time through vision. And so the car is encountering these intersections and these areas for the first time, basically, as it's driving around. And it needs to look at the images and needs to decide, these are curves, these are lane markings, this is how many lanes there are, this is where I should be to take a left turn. And so it's a much higher bar, much harder to design, but it's also much cheaper because the sensor suite is just cameras. And it's not specific to a location that you have to pre-map. So our system is very cheap and it will work anywhere. What this allows you to do then is that this affords you scale. So Waymo can have maybe a few hundred cars or something like that. We have millions of cars. And as I mentioned, scale is incredibly important to getting AI to work because everything is about dataset curation. And so I do not see how you can fundamentally really get a system to work well in absence of scale. And so I think I would much rather give up some sensing in return for scale in AI problems.
I'm kind of curious when you made your decision to go to Tesla. I mean, you must have seen that bifurcation. And was that something on your mind at the time that you thought about a lot, about what you believe is going to be the way forward?
Absolutely. I definitely saw the bifurcation. I felt like Tesla had the right approach fundamentally. And I'm a huge believer in deep neural networks and their power. And I think images provide you with a huge amount of information, and it's just a question of processing it. And these deep neural networks, I know, are capable of doing the processing that we need of them. And so to me, it's actually a brilliant strategic decision from Elon. I was absolutely on board with a vision-only approach, and I do believe that that system can be arranged to process all that information and actually drive around.
Have you ever had to sleep on a bench or a sofa in the Tesla headquarters like Elon?
So yes, I have slept at Tesla a few times, even though I live very nearby, but there were definitely a few fires where that has happened. I walked around the office and I was trying to find a nice place to find, and I found a little exercise studio. So there were a few yoga mats, and I figured yoga mat is a great place, so I just crashed there. And it was great, and I actually slept really well and could get a ride back into it in the morning, so it was actually a pretty pleasant experience.
Oh, wow.
I haven't done that in a while.
So it's not only Elon who sleeps at Tesla every now and then.
Yeah, I think it's good for the soul. You want to be invested into the problem, and you're just too caught up in it. And you don't want to travel, and I like being overtaken by problems sometimes when you're just so into it and you really want it to work, and sleep is in the way. and you just need to get it over with so that you can get back into it. So it doesn't happen too often, but when it does, I actually do enjoy it. I love the energy of the problem solving. I think it's good for the soul. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what's your view on the future of AI when we think beyond self-driving? What are the big things on the horizon for us?
I think, first of all, wow, the progress is incredibly fast. When you're zoomed into the day-to-day and the different papers that are coming out on a scale of a week, maybe sometimes it can feel slightly slow, but when you zoom out, AlexNet, as I mentioned, this ImageNet recognition benchmark that was beaten by neural net that really started the deep learning revolution and transformation was 2012. We're in 2021. So it hasn't even been a decade, and I'll get to live, hopefully, 4 more decades or something like that, maybe. From 2012 to now has been a complete transformation of AI, and a lot happened in a decade. And so if I'm going to witness something on those orders of magnitude in the next 4 years, it's really mind-boggling to extrapolate. And fundamentally, we have these algorithms that seem to be only upper bounded by the data and the compute. We're going to get more compute, and we are specializing all of our hardware to neural networks, and all of that is ongoing. Our current processors actually are not very specialized for running neural nets, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And also the size of the field has grown, and so there's a lot more brain power going into improving everything. And so there's this exponential return on all of this investment in hardware and software. And so you shouldn't expect linear improvements. You should actually expect some kind of an exponential improvements. So that's even more mind-boggling. And so I think in the short term, we're absolutely going to see much more automation, be it self-driving cars, drones or warehouses, and that's very easy to predict. But I think on the long term, that's where it starts to get kind of even more dicey, because I joined OpenAI. OpenAI is basically an AGI project, artificial general intelligence. So the idea is we're trying to develop fundamentally a artificial brain that thinks and wants and acts and functions like a human being. So I would say next to a visual cortex, we sort of have a check mark, that part of the brain we sort of maybe understand the principles of, but we certainly haven't understood the entire brain and how decision making is done and so on. But I think we are, with robotics and so on, we are probably going to make a massive dent into that over the next decade or 2 or 3. Yeah, I think we're probably going to see some very exciting things come from AI, because the technology is not really upper bounded in any real way, and it's mildly concerning but kind of exciting. So I think we'll see what happens.
Andre, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on. Learned so much. Thank you. Now, if anyone listening is like me and would like to keep learning from Andre, I highly recommend viewing and reading all the material on Andre's webpage, Karpathy.ai. This includes his talk at Tesla Autonomy Day, where he's on stage together with Elon Musk. I highly recommend following Andre on Twitter, where he very generously shares his latest insights on AI with the world. And on Twitter, that's @Karpathy. We will be posting an extended version of our interview with Andre on our website, therobotbrains.com, very soon. We are interviewing people for the podcast. Hello, my name is Peter Abiel, and welcome to the Robot Brains podcast, a show about AI and robots and the brilliant brains who make them. Today, here with me is Andre Karpathy. Andre is the Director of Artificial Intelligence and Autopilot Vision at Tesla. He's one of the world's leading visionaries in deep learning and computer vision. Ever since his PhD days at Stanford, back when deep learning was just starting to emerge as a viable technology, Andre has not only been a leading researcher, but also a leading educator. From there, he became one of the founding members of OpenAI, the AI research organization in San Francisco, initially largely funded by Elon Musk. And from there, at some point, Elon Musk then recruited Andre to head up autopilot efforts at Tesla. Andre, you and I used to spend so much time together. For listeners, Andre and I used to work together at OpenAI, but we also used to see each other at all of the AI conferences, academic working groups. But now it's actually been quite a while since we've seen each other, so I'm excited to get to catch up. I'm not even sure when is the last time we saw each other. Maybe NeurIPS, maybe my wedding, maybe Covariant offices. Do you remember?
I do. It was just before the pandemic, I think.
Right before pandemic. Must have been at NeurIPS in Vancouver. I remember the burgers we went to eat in this dive bar across the conference center.
Yep. And of course I visited Covariant and saw your offices, and we had a chance to talk there.
Which was a lot of fun. I hope we can host you again sometime soon. I actually spent most of yesterday watching all the videos listed on your website. Absolutely brilliant. what you've achieved and how you explain it there. Now, can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you went from Slovakia, age 15, to becoming Tesla's AI director?
That's a quite all-encompassing question. Yeah, it's a long story. So as you mentioned, my parents decided to immigrate to Canada when I was 15. Yeah, I was not a very happy sort of person in Slovakia. I always wanted to leave. Slovakia is not an incredibly ambitious place. I felt that I was upper bounded in terms of what I can achieve there. And so I always wanted to go to Canada, America, and do something substantial. When they kind of hinted that we may be able to go to Canada, I was on board instantly. And then my sister was not quite as on board, and everyone else in the family as well. But I sort of worked to convince everyone and make the move. We came to Canada. I started in high school. I barely spoke any English. I had to learn English. I was very good at math. Luckily, the Slovakian curriculum is quite good at math. And so I was able to sort of get into the good courses and go through high school, join the University of Toronto, and kind of get into computer science and so on. It is a long story.
It is a long story, but I think there are some really interesting parts to it. For example, somewhere I read that Jeff Hinton at Toronto is the one who first showed you neural networks.
Yeah, so in the University of Toronto is when I first came into contact sort of with deep learning through Jeff Hinton's class. And he taught a class, and at the time, this was very, very simple primordial deep learning. So we were looking at little digits, white on black, 3, 2, 4, 1, and we were trying to recognize, those digits. And so by today's standards, these were incredibly toy problems. I was fascinated by the way that Jeff Hinton spoke about these algorithms. He kept making analogies to the human brain. And, the way he talked about the neural net, it was like in the mind of the net, using these anthropomorphic descriptions for what was going on in the algorithm. And I found that analogy fascinating. And so that's kind of what pulled me in, I would say, into the entire area. And then I audited the class, and I also went to some of the reading groups that he hosted with his students. And that's basically when I became extremely interested in deep learning and have been in deep learning since.
Now, if we jump ahead a little bit, I think the first time you really were very visible as somebody in deep learning was during your PhD days at Stanford, when you were the one who were generating a lot of the research progress and educational content. How did you get going on that at Stanford?
Yeah, so I think you're alluding to CS231N, the class that I ended up basically designing to a very large extent and then being the primary instructor for, together with Fei. And it was really the first deep learning class at Stanford and became extremely successful. So in the first offering, it was maybe 150 students or so. And by the time I left, it was 700 or so. And so this became one of the biggest classes at Stanford. And the way it came about, I've always had a passion for teaching. And even during my master's degree at University of British Columbia, TAing different classes was always the highlight of my experience. I just love watching people learn new skills and then go out and do cool things with those skills. I feel like it's such a large lever over kind of impact. It's indirect, but I think it's a very large lever. I was really, just very passionate about teaching in general. And deep learning at the time was starting to have some of its first successes. So in 2012, we had the first convolutional neural network give stunning performance on this ImageNet benchmark in computer vision and image classification. And a lot of people suddenly paid a lot of attention to deep learning. And I happened to be in a place where I understood the technology, and I was very passionate about teaching. And Fei approached me, and she pitched me on the idea that, hey, we could start a class and actually teach people about this. I instantly jumped at the idea. I loved it. I put my entire PhD in research on hold. It's not something you would typically want to do as a PhD student because your primary output is research. And I ended up not doing basically any research for maybe a year because I just focused on the class and its design. But I felt like it was probably more impactful than getting a paper or two out to actually do this class and do a good job of it. And yeah, so we came up with the curriculum and taught it, and it was amazing. And it was probably the highlight of my PhD.
So Andre, I mean, a lot of people already know this, but some people probably don't. I mean, you're saying this class went from 150 to 700 students from year 1 to year 2. But the reality is much bigger than that, of course. I mean, this class was put on YouTube, and there were hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of people watching your lectures, because it wasn't just the first Stanford class. It was the class that everybody was watching, following along, because deep learning was this new thing, and it was the place you would go if you wanted to understand it. You had to go to Andre Karpathy's class. That's where everybody went. I just want to clarify, there's more than 700 people who were active in that class.
Yeah, absolutely. I did think it had a larger reach than I had anticipated at the time, of course, by a lot. People come up to me randomly in conferences and even in a coffee shop and tell me that they saw my class and they really enjoyed it. And I've heard it many times, but it always brings the same amount of pleasure. And so I feel like that was a very good investment in time. Very proud of it.
When you go and check out one of Andre's videos, the most frequent comment is just 2 words: my hero. That's, you opened up a whole field for so many people that was hard to access, and all of a sudden they could be part of it. Now, how would you explain that moment that triggered you teaching the class? You said ImageNet happened in 2012. What happened there? What was that all about?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when I first encountered deep learning in Jeff Hinton's class, we were working with these tiny black and white images. So these are tiny 28 by 28 images where you have like a single digit, like a 7 or a 6, and we're trying to recognize like what it is. And so deep learning, which is this class of neural networks approaches where you basically have neurons that are connected to each other with different strengths, and you're trying to tune the strengths between the neurons so that they take your input, in this case, this image, and try to, the neurons fire in a sequence, and then the last neurons tell you which digit it is in the image. And so it's a class of technology that was used in these super toy problems. And when I entered Stanford and I was in computer vision, these approaches were not what you would use for computer vision applications. So computer vision was a field that was mostly working with much larger, higher resolution images. So we're talking, 1, 2, 3 megapixel inputs. So 1,000 by 1,000 images, real normal big images. And it was thought, and there was a very different class of approaches to how you, attack computer vision problems in those settings. And so at the time, no one was using deep learning in computer vision. Deep learning was this branch of machine learning out there somewhere, and it was very different, not used. And it was thought, the conventional wisdom at the time was that these approaches would not scale to large resolution images. And it was in 2012 that Jeff Hinton and his team in the University of Toronto, Skrzewski and Ilya Sutskever,